The yellow dust of Sulphur Canyon. The alkaline dust of the sulfur flats didn't just settle on Clara Cross's clothes. It worked its way into her teeth, her throat, and the raw blisters on her palms. For 3 days she had ridden a dying buckskin horse through the jagged wastes, guided only by the rumors of a man who had forgotten the sound of his own name. The air down here smelled of rotting eggs and burnt copper, a toxic soup that turned the horizon into a shimmering, sickly mirage. Her brother's silver pocket watch now stopped permanently at 4 o'clock, the exact moment. They had kicked the chair from beneath him, clinked against the iron stirrup with every agonizing stride. Clara wasn't a fighter. She was a schoolteacher from the green valleys of Ohio, but the West had a way of stripping away everything soft until only the bone remained. Her brother Silas had been framed for a train robbery by Baron Sterling, the ruthless railroad tycoon who owned every scrap of dirt, law, and flesh from here to the Pacific. When Silas refused to sign over their family's homestead deed, Sterling hanged him from a water tower. Now, Clara had nothing left but a half-empty canteen, a stolen Colt revolver that felt too heavy for her wrist, and a desperate gamble. She found the hideout at the base of a bleeding red cliff. It wasn't a cabin. It was a dugout, hollowed out of the clay and reinforced, with blackened railroad ties and petrified wood. The ground around it was a warning track, bleached skulls of bighorn, sheep mounted on iron spikes, their empty sockets staring into the wasteland. Sitting on a crate in the shadow of the dugout was the man the valley folks called Eli the Ghost McCall. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a mountain that had learned how to bleed. "If you're here to beg, the well is dry," a voice rumbled from the shadows. It was a sound like gravel shifting in a rushing river. Eli McCall was massive, his frame wrapped in a grease-stained canvas duster that had seen more winters than Clara had lived. His face was a map of old wars, a deep, jagged crater marked where his left eye used to be, now covered by a cracked leather patch. His remaining eye was a piercing, predatory amber. He didn't look up from his work. His enormous, scarred hands were methodically cleaning a massive buffalo gun, the metal gleaming with black oil. Clara dismounted, her boots sinking into the powdery yellow dirt, her knees buckling from sheer exhaustion. She drew herself up, refusing to let him see her shake. "I am not here to beg," Clara said, her voice raspy but fierce. She pulled the heavy iron Colt from her belt and laid it flat on the crate next to his rifle oil. "I am here to hire an executioner. My name is Clara Cross. Baron Sterling murdered my brother." Eli finally lifted his amber eye. He looked at the gun, then at her, taking in her sun-scorched skin, the blood drying through her split lips, and the absolute lack of fear in her gaze. It was the look of a person who had already died once and had nothing left to lose. He let out a dry, hacking laugh that sounded like a cough. "Sterling has 50 hired guns, the territorial marshal in his pocket, and a Gatling gun mounted on his private train," Eli rumbled, turning back to his rifle. "You brought a rusty six-shooter and a grudge. Go back to the valley, girl. Die in a bed, not in the dirt." Clara didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed leather pouch. She dumped its contents onto the crate. It wasn't gold coins. It was a collection of raw, glistening silver ore, laced with deep blue veins of exceptional purity. "This is the map and the sample from the Blackwood Ridge," Clara whispered, leaning closer. "My father found it before he died. Silas died keeping it secret. Sterling doesn't know where the vein is, only that it's on our land. If you put a bullet through Baron Sterling's heart, half of that ridge is yours. The other half stays with me." Eli stopped. His scarred hand hovered over the silver nugget. He picked it up, feeling its unnatural weight, his face darkening. The name Sterling brought a visible tension to his jaw, the muscles locking tightly beneath his gray-streaked beard. 10 years ago, Eli McCall had been the chief tracker for the territory until Sterling's men burned his homestead, took his eye, and left him for dead in this very canyon. "I don't care about the silver," Eli said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "But I care about the man who broke my world. If I go down that mountain with you, Clara Cross, there is no turning back. We don't use judges, we use lead." They left before the sun could cook the flats. Eli rode a massive, ugly iron-gray stallion that looked as mean as he was, while Clara took the lead on her rested buckskin. They hadn't even cleared the canyon mouth when the wind shifted. bringing the distinct smell of horse sweat and cheap tobacco. Eli instantly raised a hand, halting the horses in the shadow of a massive boulder. "Two riders," Eli muttered, unslung his heavy Sharps rifle with an ease that defied its weight. "Sterling scouts. They tracked your horse's broken shoe from the lower trail. They're sloppy, but they're fast." Before Clara could answer, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. A bullet chipped the red rock inches above her head, showering her hair with sharp flint and red dust. Her buckskin reared in panic, but Eli grabbed the reins with one hand, violently forcing the animal down, while his other hand leveled the buffalo gun. Boom! The roar of Eli's Sharps rifle was deafening, a cannon-like blast that shook the canyon walls. Down the trail, 100 yards away, a man in a black duster was lifted completely out of his saddle, his chest cavity imploded by the massive slug. He hit the rocks with a sickening thud and didn't move. The second scout, realizing they had run into a monster, tried to wheel his horse around to sprint back to the valley. "Load the pistol!" Eli roared at Clara as he racked the heavy lever of his rifle. Clara's hands shook violently as she pulled. The Colt. The remaining scout fired a wild pistol shot over his shoulder as he fled. Clara, acting on pure survival instinct, leveled her gun with both hands, rested her arms on the boulder, and squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked like a wild beast, the muzzle flash blinding her. The bullet caught the fleeing scout's horse in the flank. The animal collapsed violently, throwing the rider headfirst into a pile of jagged shale. The man groaned, his leg pinned beneath the thrashing beast. Eli walked over to the pinned scout with a slow, heavy stride, his boots crunching on the gravel. The scout was bleeding from the forehead, his face pale with terror as the shadow of the one-eyed giant fell over him. He recognized the leather patch, the massive frame. "McCall!" The scout gasped, his fingers fumbling for his dropped revolver. "You're dead. Sterling killed you." Eli didn't say a word. He placed his heavy leather boot on the man's throat, cutting off his air, and leaned down. "Where is Sterling?" The town of Brimstone," the man choked out, his eyes bulging. "He's waiting for the payroll train. He sent 10 of us to find the girl." "They're coming!" "They're right behind us." Eli didn't waste a bullet. He increased the pressure of his boot until a sickening crack echoed through the canyon. The scout's body went limp. Clara watched from her horse, a cold sweat breaking out across her ribs. The casual, mechanical brutality of the act made her stomach turn, but she forced the bile back down. This was the monster she had hired. "We can't take the main road now," Eli said, wiping the dust from his rifle as he walked back to his horse. "Sterling's main force will be checking the way stations. We take the Devil's Backbone, the high timberline. It's a bitter, freezing trail, but it keeps us out of sight." As they climbed higher into the pine forests, the scorching heat of the flats turned into a biting, brittle cold. The towering ponderosas blocked out the sun, casting long, bruised shadows across the early snowpack. Clara's thin wool coat offered little protection against the mountain wind, but she didn't complain. She kept her eyes fixed on Eli's broad, scarred back. He was a creature of this harsh world, indifferent to the pain, moving with a terrifying focus. By the 5th day, they reached the outskirts of Brimstone. The town was a miserable black scar on the landscape, built entirely around the railroad, tracks, and the coal mines that fueled Sterling's empire. The air was thick with soot and sulfur, turning the snow into a greasy gray slush. Unpainted timber buildings squatted in the mud like rotting teeth, and the constant, rhythmic chug-chug of steam engines filled the air like the heartbeat of a mechanical beast. They left their horses at an abandoned logging camp a mile out and walked into town under the cover of a freezing twilight. Eli had pulled his hat low, his canvas duster wrapped tightly to conceal his massive frame and his weapons. They slipped into the General Mercantile through the back alley, the bell above the door muffled by Eli's massive hand as they entered. The storekeeper, an old, stooped man named Silas Thorne, was cleaning the counter. When he looked up and saw the one-eyed giant standing in the shadows, he dropped his oil lamp, the glass shattering on the floorboards. "Eli," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling like dry leaves. "Good God, man. If Sterling finds out you're alive, he'll burn this entire town to the ground just to catch your ashes. I need lead black powder and kerosene, Silas," Eli said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. and I need to know where Sterling is keeping his men." Thorne looked at Clara, then back at Eli, sweating despite the freezing air in the shop. "He's at the Grand Western Hotel across from the station. He's got 20 hired killers from the Texas border staying in the saloon downstairs. They're waiting for the gold train tomorrow morning. Eli, you can't go over there. It's a slaughterhouse." "Good," Eli muttered, tossing a piece of raw silver onto the counter. "I brought a hunger for it." The plan was to wait for dawn, but the West rarely respects a plan. As Clara and Eli stepped back into the dark alley behind the mercantile, the sound of cocking rifles shattered the silence. 3 men stepped out from the shadows of the livery stable, their repeating rifles leveled directly at Eli's chest. In the center was Sterling's chief enforcer, a sadistic gunslinger named Cold Eye Vance, his face disfigured by an old explosion. "Well, look what the cat dragged down from the mountain," Vance sneered, a gold tooth glinting in the dark. "The ghost himself. Baron Sterling is going to pay me a fortune for your other eye, McCall. And the girl? The Baron has special plans for her." Eli didn't hesitate. He didn't drop his rifle. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he threw his massive body sideways into Clara, knocking her behind. A stack of heavy timber cords, just as the alley exploded with gunfire. "Spit! Spit!" Crack! Bullets tore through the wooden crates, showering them with splinters. Eli rolled onto his back, his heavy Sharps rifle barking once. The blast took off Vance's left shoulder, throwing the enforcer into the mud screaming. Clara, pinned behind the timber, felt a surge of adrenaline clear her panic. She saw one of the hired guns stepping forward to flank Eli, his rifle raised. She pulled her Colt, leveled it with both hands, and fired through a gap in the wooden logs. The bullet caught the man squarely in the throat. He gurgled, dropping his rifle, his hands clutching the fountain of crimson pouring down his chest. Eli grabbed a jar of kerosene they had just bought, smashed it against the side of the livery stable where the third shooter was hiding, and fired a pistol shot into the puddle. A roaring wall of orange fire erupted, engulfing the building and sending the last shooter running into the street, his clothes ablaze, screaming in agony. The gunfire had alerted the town. The rhythmic clanging of the railroad security bell began to echo through the soot-choked streets. Eli dragged Clara through a maze of coal chalets, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He was leaning heavily against her small frame now, his duster soaked with fresh, dark blood. A rifle slug had caught him in the meat of his thigh during the chaos, and another had grazed his ribs. They found shelter in the basement of an abandoned brewery, the air smelling of stale yeast and damp stone. Eli collapsed against a brick pillar, his face pale beneath the dirt, his teeth bared in silent agony. "You need to pull the slug out," Eli rasped, tossing her a wicked, bone-handled hunting knife and a flask of cheap rye whiskey. "If it stays in, the leg rots. I can't hunt with a dead leg." Clara took the knife. Her hands were caked in soot and another man's blood, but her mind had gone cold and focused. She had spent years tending to injured farmhands in Ohio. She knew the anatomy of a wound. She poured the whiskey over the blade and then over Eli's open thigh. The giant didn't scream. His knuckles simply turned white as he bit down on a piece of leather rigging, his muscles locking like iron. "Hold still," Clara whispered, her voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone of a teacher. She dug the tip of the blade into the angry red wound, searching for the lead. The smell of copper and raw meat filled the damp basement. With a steady, deliberate twist, she popped the flattened piece of lead out of the muscle. It hit the stone floor with a dull clink. She quickly soaked a rag in whiskey, packed it into the wound, and tied it off tightly with a strip torn from her own petticoat. Eli let out a long, shuddering breath, his head falling back against the brick. He looked at her through his single amber eye, a strange, dark respect flickering in his gaze. "You've got a cold spine, Clara Cross. Most town girls would have fainted by now. The town girl died when they hanged my brother," she said flatly, wiping the knife on her skirt. "Tomorrow we finish this." The next morning broke gray and heavy, a thick shroud of freezing fog rolling off the mountains and burying the railroad tracks in a ghostly white mist. The gold train was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock, and Baron Sterling would be there to oversee the transfer to his private vault. Eli, limping heavily but his face a mask of immovable stone, spent the early hours preparing the battlefield. They couldn't fight 20 men in the open. They needed to control the terrain. He had smuggled 3 crates of old mining dynamite from the abandoned logging camp, and now he and Clara were wiring them beneath the wooden supports of the railroad. Water Tower, the very tower where Clara's brother had been executed. When the train pulls in, Sterling will step onto the platform, Eli explained, his voice low as he connected the copper wire to a small brass plunger hidden behind a pile of coal bags. His men will fan out to clear the area. That's when we strike. You stay behind the coal bins with the repeating rifle. You don't look for glory. You just shoot anything in a black duster. Clara took the Winchester rifle, its metal cold against her raw fingers. She looked up at the water tower, her eyes burning with a quiet, devastating grief. She could almost see Silas's boots swinging against the gray timber. "He's going to pay, Silas," she whispered to the wind. The distant, low wail of a locomotive whistle broke the silence. The ground began to vibrate as the massive, black iron engine groaned into the station, its iron wheels screeching against the rails, belching a thick cloud of white steam that mixed with the freezing fog. The trap was set. The prey had arrived. The passenger car door opened, and a dozen heavily armed men stepped onto the wooden platform, their eyes scanning the fog. In the center walked Baron Sterling. He was an impeccably dressed man, wearing a tailored fur-lined coat, a silk top hat, and a gold-headed cane. His face was a mask of aristocratic arrogance, completely untouched by the misery of the town he owned. "Vance!" Sterling shouted into the fog, his voice sharp and demanding. "Where is that useless dog?" "He was supposed to have the girl by now." Eli looked at Clara and nodded. He grabbed the brass plunger and slammed it down. Boom! The explosion was magnificent. The entire base of the wooden water tower disintegrated into a shower of splintered timber and roaring fire. Thousands of gallons of freezing water and shattered wood erupted outward, crashing down onto the platform like a tidal wave. 3 of Sterling's guards were crushed instantly under the falling beams. Others were thrown into the mud, their weapons lost in the chaos. "Ambush!" Someone screamed through the steam. Clara didn't wait. She rose from behind the coal bins, leveled the Winchester, and began firing into the panicked crowd. Crack! 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 Her shots found their marks. A hired gun trying to draw his pistol dropped into the slush. Another was spun around as her bullet caught him in the shoulder. Eli stepped out of the fog like a vengeful deity, his heavy Sharps rifle roaring with mechanical rhythm. Every time his rifle barked, a man died. He didn't take cover. He just kept walking forward, his duster whipping in the wind, a terrifying silhouette of violence. The shootout was brief but apocalyptic. The platform was covered in shattered timber, crimson slush, and the groans of dying men. The remaining guards, realizing they were fighting a demon from the high country, fled into the foggy streets, abandoning their employer. Baron Sterling was left standing alone near the wheels of his private car, his fur coat ruined, his top hat lost in the mud. His hands trembled as he pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his vest, his eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged terror as Eli McCall closed the distance. "McCall!" Sterling gasped, his voice cracking as he backed against the iron wheel of the train. "I can make you rich. The silver vein? We can split it. 3 ways, you, me, and the girl. Just let me live!" Eli stopped 5 feet away, his buffalo gun resting on his shoulder. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at Clara, who was stepping over the debris, her Winchester still smoking, her face streaked with soot and blood. "The contract belongs to her," Eli said flatly. Clara walked up to the billionaire, her boots splashing in the bloody mud. She looked down the barrel of her Colt, pointing it straight between Sterling's terrified blue eyes. She didn't shake. She didn't hesitate. "This is for Silas," Clara whispered. Bang! The derringer dropped from Sterling's hand as he slumped against the train wheel. A neat, dark hole drilled perfectly into his forehead. His eyes stared blankly into the gray sky, his empire ending in a patch of dirty snow. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the train's steam valves. Clara lowered the gun, her chest heaving as a long, shaky breath escaped her lips. The weight of the last week seemed to lift from her shoulders, leaving her exhausted but whole. Eli walked to her side, his amber eye looking down at the dead tycoon, then at her. He didn't offer a word of comfort or a gentle touch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy pouch of silver ore, and handed it to her. "The ridge is ours," Eli grunted, a faint, grim smirk appearing beneath his beard. "But we're going to need a lot of lumber to rebuild that homestead." Clara looked at the silver, then up at the massive, scarred man who had become her weapon and now her partner. She wiped the blood from her cheek and nodded. "Let's go home, Eli," she said. They turned their backs on the smoking ruins of Brimstone, walking together toward the high mountains. Two survivors bound by blood and iron, ready to claim the dirt they had paid for in flesh. The death of Baron Sterling transformed Brimstone overnight. The townspeople, who had lived under his shadow for years, now walked in a dazed, hollow silence. Clara holstered her Colt, her fingers still trembling, but her eyes held a new, cold clarity. Eli stood beside her, his massive frame looming over the muddy platform. His single amber eye was fixed on Sterling's body, his gaze devoid of pity, only a deep, weary satisfaction. "You did it, Clara," Eli rumbled, his voice lacking its usual abrasive edge.
"The tyrant is gone."
"The town, the tracks, and the Blackwood Ridge, it all belongs to you now." Clara stared at the billionaire whose finery was now soaked in filth. She pulled her brother's silver watch from her pocket. The hands were still frozen at 4 o'clock. "Silas won't be coming back, Eli. This wasn't a fresh start. It was a final act of accounting." Eli reached into his duster and produced the raw silver nugget she had given him on that first day at the dugout. He pressed it back into her palm. "I didn't come here for the fortune. I came to see the man who burned my life turn to ash. That debt is settled. I'm heading back to the high country." "No," Clara said, her voice firm. "We made a bargain. Half that ridge is yours. You aren't walking away into the mountains alone. Sterling had men everywhere. Word will spread and we will be hunted. We finish this together." Eli hesitated, then let out a ragged sigh. He saw the shift in her. The schoolteacher was gone, replaced by someone who knew the exact cost of survival. They mounted their horses and rode out of that hellish station, leaving behind a burning empire and heading into a horizon that promised only new dangers. The journey to Blackwood Ridge was a gauntlet. The rumors of Sterling's death had acted like blood in the water. His enforcers, the elite, ruthless remnants of his private army, were not grieving. They were salivating at the thought of a massive, unclaimed silver vein. "We have to move like smoke," Eli said, huddled over a small, smokeless fire in the deep timberline. His leg, still bandaged from Clara's surgery, throbbed with every movement. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. We're carrying the biggest target in the territory." Clara polished her Winchester with a rag, her movements methodical. "I'm not afraid of them, Eli. I've lost everything they could possibly take." A faint chilling sound cut through the forest silence, the baying of hounds. Eli's head snapped up, his single eye scanning the darkness. 5 riders. They've picked up our scent. They're closing the gap." Eli kicked dirt over the embers, plunging them into absolute darkness. This was no longer a pursuit. It was a predatory game. "Stay close, Clara. Don't speak. We're moving to the high rocks." The forest was thick, the moonlight blocked by dense pine canopy. The trackers, calling themselves the Silver Hawks, were vicious, men who took joy in the chase. Their hounds were relentless, their yapping echoing against the canyon walls, making it impossible to hide. "We need to silence those dogs," Eli whispered, reaching for a recurved bow he had fashioned from ash wood. Guns were too loud for this terrain. Clara watched from behind a massive cedar. 2 men were leading, their shadows dancing against the trees. She raised her rifle, but Eli clamped a hand over her barrel. "Wait, let them come into the kill zone." As the lead men passed, Eli threw a heavy rock into the brush to their left. They turned, distracted. In a blur of motion, Eli descended from the shadows like a falling statue, snapping one man's neck and silencing the second with a blade to the throat. It was brutal and efficient. However, the remaining 3 reacted instantly, their rifles barking fire into the darkness. Clara leveled her Winchester, her fire disciplined and precise, catching one man in the chest as the forest erupted into chaos. The skirmish left them breathless, scrambling toward the jagged peaks of the ridge. The temperature plummeted, the air turning into biting needles that stung their lungs. Clara was exhausted, but her mind was fueled by the cold resolve that had carried her across the flats. "There's an old mining tunnel near the summit," Eli gasped, clutching his side where a graze had reopened. If we hold the entrance, they can't flank us. It's a bottleneck. They reached the tunnel mouth, hidden by a heavy curtain of snow and frozen shale. But as they stepped into the dim light, they froze. The interior was already lit by oil lanterns. Sterling's men had arrived first, anticipating their route.
How?
Clara whispered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Eli's face hardened. We weren't being tracked. We were being herded. This was a trap all along. They were pinned. Eli pulled a stick of dynamite from his belt, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, sacrificial light. Clara, when I give the word, fire at the timber supports above the entrance. We're going to bring this whole mountain down on their heads. When the sun sank behind Wyoming's golden, frost-bitten peaks, Clara Cross had allowed herself to believe that the worst was finally behind them. 5 years had passed since they'd left. Brimstone's blood-soaked railway station. They'd built something modest and quiet in a narrow valley tucked between the mountains. A log cabin, a small barn, a handful of cattle. Eli McCall had hung his heavy Sharps rifle on the wall beside the cabin door, but his one amber eye never fully closed. He was a wounded animal who never surrendered his vigilance. The old bullet wounds scattered across his body ached savagely in cold weather, giving his gait a heavy, dragging quality. But his grip remained iron-hard. Clara herself had long since shed the softness of a schoolteacher. Her hands were now rough and calloused from working the earth and gripping the stiff leather of horse reins. But in this merciless West, peace was never a thing that stayed long with anyone. One cold evening, the wind shifted without warning. It carried with it the smell of dry grass and burning wood. Eli, who had been splitting logs outside with an axe, stopped mid-swing. He dropped the axe where he stood and stepped inside. His face had gone to stone, and something ancient and terrible had returned to his one good eye. "Clara," he said, his voice low and heavy as iron, "pick up your pistol and load the rifle. We are not alone." From outside came the sound of hooves, not a traveler's, but at least 10 horses moving hard toward their land. These were not the remnants of Baron Sterling's old loyalists. These were the death merchants of the Iron Syndicate, who had seized Sterling's entire operation after his killing and now wanted the blood-stained silver mine map and the original land papers that Clara had kept hidden. Their leader rode at the front, a ruthless, cold-blooded man known as Colonel Vance the Skinner Blackwood. He reined his black stallion to a halt and stared at the cabin. He held a burning torch in one hand. "Eli McCall! Clara Cross! Come out!" His voice rolled through the trees like thunder. "Did you think you could disappear into some corner of creation? And we'd never find you?" Sterling was a soft, rich man. "But we are land merchants. Give us the map or we burn this cabin to ash and you with it." Clara watched from behind the window curtain, her pulse hammering, but not one flicker of fear crossed her face. She felt her brother Silas's pocket watch against her hip, then thumbed fresh rounds into her old Colt revolver. Eli lifted his heavy buffalo gun and braced it against the window frame. "We're not going out there," Clara said, meeting Eli's eyes. A terrible smile crossed his weathered face. "I made a deal with death a long time ago. Clara, looks like it's come to collect its share." Before any of Blackwood's men could advance, Eli's buffalo gun answered first. Boom! The window glass exploded outward, and a man flew from his saddle and hit the dirt with a hole, the size of a fist in his chest. But the enemy was prepared. They began hurling lit torches and kerosene bottles at the cabin. Within moments, sheets of flame were crawling up the wooden roof. The smoke thickened until drawing breath was agony. Clara picked off 2 more men through the broken window, but the fire was swallowing the cabin whole. They had to move or they would burn with it. Eli kicked the rear door off its hinges with one savage blow. "Run, Clara! To the horses!" They burst through smoke and flame into the frozen darkness, their 5 years of hard-built life roaring and collapsing to ash at their backs. The wind howled like a starving wolf as Clara and Eli drove hard toward the high ridge of Teton Pass. Behind them, the fire from their cabin had become little more than a dim, orange smear on the dark sky, but it had lit the night well enough to betray their direction. Blackwood's men were still behind them, the labored breathing of their horses cutting through the screaming blizzard. Eli's iron-gray stallion churned through the snow and kept moving, but Eli himself kept sagging forward in the saddle, A stray round had grazed his old wounded leg during the escape from the cabin, and now frozen blood had stiffened his duster from the inside. Clara rode close behind on her buckskin, her hands locked on the reins, her fingers turning the color of a bruise in the cold. "Eli, you're losing blood! We can't keep this pace!" she shouted, but the wind tore her words to nothing. Eli didn't look back. His entire focus was on the pass ahead, where a savage snowstorm waited to either shelter or bury them. "If we stop, the snow buries us." "If we slow down, Blackwood's dogs tear us apart," he said through clenched teeth. The trail through the pass was so narrow that a single wrong step meant a drop of thousands of feet into a black chasm below. Fine crystals of wind-blown ice stung their faces and eyes like thrown needles. Then Clara's buckskin struck a hidden rock beneath the snow and stumbled violently. She was pitched from the saddle and plunged deep into a drift, her colt spinning out of her hand and vanishing into the white. "Clara!" Eli wrenched his stallion to a brutal stop. Ignoring the screaming pain in his leg, he dropped from the saddle and fought through the snow to reach her. He hauled her upright with both hands, but in the same instant, rifle fire cracked from the slope below and rounds skipped off the icy rock face. Beside them. "Ping! Spit!" Blackwood's men had spotted them. Eli shoved Clara behind a boulder and threw himself flat in the snow with his Sharp's rifle. He pressed his one amber eye to the scope. Through the storm, a rider-shaped shadow pushed toward them. Eli held his breath. In this cold, even a flinch would pull the shot wide. Boom! The Sharps roared and its echo shook. A small shelf of snow loose from the slope above. The rider was thrown backward off his horse, and the animal bolted screaming toward the drop, but the rest kept climbing. Eli felt the truth plainly now. He was nearly out of ammunition, and his leg had gone entirely numb. He looked at Clara, whose hair had gone white with packed snow, but whose eyes still held the same fire. He'd first seen the day Silas died. She had found her pistol, digging it out of the snow with bare hands. "Eli, we have to stop them here on this narrow stretch. If they make it to the top, we're surrounded and finished." Eli nodded slowly. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a single stick of dynamite he'd grabbed while fleeing the burning cabin. "Then we closed the road," he said, and the dynamite sealed the pass. The explosion brought enough rock and snow down to trap Blackwood and his surviving men on the lower side of the mountain, pinned and furious and unable to follow. But what waited for them on the other side of Teton Pass was its own kind of hell. For 3 days they drifted through frozen valleys with no shelter and dwindling supplies, until at last they reached the edge of Deadwood, a populated but thoroughly lawless town, a city of filth and desperation born from gold and coal seams. No real law operated inside its borders. The streets were rivers of black mud, and the air carried the permanent stink of cheap whiskey, horse dung, and burning coal smoke. The tinny, off-key sound of a saloon, piano, and the noise of men shouting and fighting in the darkness made the place feel less like a town and more like the waiting room of some private damnation. Eli could no longer ride upright. His iron-gray stallion carried him into town on instinct. But Eli himself was burning with fever, and his wounded leg had gone black at the wound's edges, the unmistakable color of spreading poison. Clara got him down behind an old, half-collapsed livery stable at the edge of town. She needed medicine, or a doctor, or both, and she needed them before morning. But in Deadwood, everything cost either blood or gold. She laid Eli down on a pile of dry straw and spread her duster over him. As his eyes were dimming, he caught her hand. "Clara, this town, don't trust a single soul in it. Men here will sell their own mother for 1 silver coin." Clara pressed his hand between hers. "You taught me how to fight," she said. "Now it's my turn." Clara pulled her hat low and made her way toward the largest saloon in Deadwood, a rotten smoke establishment called the Devil's Spit. She had no money, but she had a small corner of the silver ore map, and she was willing to part with enough of it to buy the medicine that might keep Eli alive. She pushed through the heavy wooden door and the full weight of the place hit her, the fog of tobacco smoke, the reek of unwashed men, the sour smell of spilled spirits soaking into old wood. Gamblers, drifters, and hard-eyed killers filled the tables. Clara walked straight to the bar. "I need a doctor and something to stop a man from being poisoned by a bad wound." "I have no gold, but I have this." She placed a small piece of silver ore on the counter, a piece she had kept hidden for 5 years. The bartender picked it up, bit it, and his eyes sharpened with greed. But he wasn't the only one watching. From the corner of the saloon, a man with a long scar running from his ear to his jaw stood slowly. He was corrupt Sheriff Silas Vance, no relation to the colonel, but just as rotten and a paid instrument of the Iron Syndicate. He looked Clara over with the calm, satisfied eyes of a man who has just recognized something valuable. "A lone woman walking into Deadwood with ore like that?" he said, his voice carrying that particular oiled quality of a man who has never once in his life done an honest thing. "That ore only comes from one place, Blackwood Ridge. You're Clara Cross, aren't you?" Clara's heart drove hard against her ribs. She stepped back, but the moment she did, 2 of Vance's men moved to block the saloon door behind her. Clara felt it then. She had walked out of one trap and directly into a worse one, and this time Eli McCall was not standing at her side. The devil's spit. Saloon had gone quiet in that particular way that only happens when every man in a room smells blood about to be spilled. Cards stopped flipping. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the piano player's fingers lifted off the keys. Every eye in the place had shifted to Clara Cross, the lone woman standing at the bar with her back, now dangerously exposed to Sheriff Silas, Vance and his 2 blockers at the door. Clara didn't move. She had learned long ago from the hardest possible teacher that the moment you flinched in front of a predator was the moment you became prey. She kept her hand resting loosely on the bar top, just inches from her Colt, and she let her eyes move slowly around the room, counting, measuring, calculating the way Eli had drilled into her on 100 cold mornings. Vance walked toward her with that slow, deliberate swagger of a man who believed he had already won. His scar caught the yellow lamplight and gave his face a split, almost reptilian quality. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked her up and down, the way a butcher examines livestock. "Word came through 3 days ago," he said, almost conversationally. "The Iron Syndicate put a price on a woman matching your description, and on a one-eyed old wolf named McCall." He tilted his head slightly. "The old wolf is already dead, I'm guessing, or you wouldn't be in here alone begging for medicine." He said it deliberately, watching for the crack in her face that grief would make, like a shadow that had decided to take on weight and form. A lean, angular man in a long gray coat, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than wood and left unfinished. He was perhaps 50, with deep-set pale eyes, that held the particular flat quality of a man who has spent a long time looking at things he cannot unsee. He held both hands slightly away from his body, palms visible. An old gunfighter's greeting that meant "I am not drawing first." "You made quite an impression back there," he said, stepping inside and pulling the stable door shut behind him. "Vance's coat is still on fire, last I saw." Clara had her Colt leveled at his chest before he'd finished the sentence. "Who are you and what do you want?" she said. Not a question, a demand. Crow looked at the gun with the mild, unimpressed expression of a man who has had many guns pointed at him and has simply outlived all of them. "My name is Devlin Crow. 3 years ago, the Iron Syndicate took my mining claim outside of Laramie, forged papers, bought Judge, 2 of my partners killed and made to look like accidents." He paused. "I've been following Vance for 6 months, waiting for the right moment to burn his operation to the ground. Then you walked into his saloon tonight and did more damage in 4 minutes than I managed in half a year." He looked past her at Eli's still form in the straw. "Your man is bad. That leg needs to come clean tonight or he won't see morning." Clara kept the Colt up. "Why would you help us?" Crow reached slowly into his coat and produced a small glass bottle, dark, with a hand-lettered paper label, carbolic acid and a folded paper of white powder beside it. "Because I came prepared," he said simply, "and because the enemy of the Iron Syndicate is the only friend worth having in this territory." Clara studied him for a long 5 seconds. She thought about what Eli had told her. Don't trust a soul in this town. She thought about the way Crow had watched Vance in the saloon, that flat, patient, particular hatred. She lowered the Colt 2 inches. Not all the way, just 2 inches. Crow went to work on Eli's leg without ceremony or hesitation, cleaning the blackened wound with the carbolic acid and packing it with the powder. which he named as a compound he'd gotten from a Shoshone medicine man 2 winters ago, and trusted more than anything an Eastern doctor had ever given him. Eli hissed and came half awake during the cleaning, his hands shooting out and grabbing Crow's wrist with surprising force. Crow didn't flinch. "Easy, old wolf," he said quietly. "I'm not the one you're fighting tonight." Eli's one amber eye focused slowly on Crow's face. Some old animal instinct seemed to take a reading, and then his grip relaxed by degrees. He sank back into the straw. "Clara," he said, barely above a whisper, "is he straight?" Clara looked at Crow, at his hands, at his eyes, at the careful, unhurried way he was working to save a man he had no reason to save. "Straight enough," she said. Crow sat back when he was finished and wiped his hands on a piece of clean cloth. Outside, they could hear Vance's men moving through the street 2 rows over, lanterns swinging, voices sharp and irritated. Crow looked at Clara with those flat, pale eyes. "Vance will seal every road out of Deadwood by dawn," he said. "He'll have men at the livery, the hotel, and the mining office. The only way out of this town that he won't be watching is the coal tunnel that runs under the eastern ridge. It connects to the old freight road 3 miles out." He looked at Eli. "Can he ride by morning?" Clara looked at the man who had dragged her out of more burning buildings and frozen mountain passes than she could count. She thought about what he'd said once, a long time ago. "On a different cold night, I've been dying since I was 22. I'm just slow about finishing it." "He'll ride," she says. On the first day, they covered good ground and spoke little. The silence between the 3 of them was not uncomfortable, but it was calibrated, each person maintaining their own careful interior distance, not yet fully committed to the coalition. They had formed, by necessity, around a fire in a stone way station. Clara thought about trust and what it actually meant in practical terms. Trust was not a feeling. Eli had told her that once, in the first months after Brimstone, when she had been inclined to extend it too, freely out of gratitude and loneliness. Trust was a structural assessment. You looked at what a person had done, what they had risked, what they had chosen when choosing was costly, and you built a picture from evidence rather than instinct. By that measure, Crow was not yet trusted, but his evidence was accumulating. That evening, they made camp in a dry creek bed that offered cover from the wind and a clean sightline in 3 directions. Crow built the fire small and low, which was the right choice. While they ate salt pork and hardtack in the firelight, Eli looked across at Crow and said, "Tell me about the 2 times you tried to get into the Cheyenne office." Crow chewed slowly and considered the question. "First time 8 months ago. I got as far as the building's back entrance before one of Goss's outside men made me. I ran. He didn't follow far enough to be a problem." He paused. "Second time 5 months ago. I had a contact inside, a clerk named Aldous. Webb, who had his own grievances against Goss. Webb was going to get me through the back and to the manager's floor." Another pause, longer. "They found Webb 3 days before I was due to go in. Hung him from the telegraph pole outside the office as a message." He said it without visible emotion, which Clara recognized as the specific emotional management of a person who has processed something terrible into something functional. Eli nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "So Goss has an information source. Someone tells him when he's being watched." Crow nodded. "I believe it's someone in the territorial marshal's office. Goss has 3 marshals on his payroll that I know of by name." Clara looked up from the fire. "Then we can't use any official channels. No marshals, no county offices, nothing with a paper trail that reaches Cheyenne before we do." "Correct," Crow said. Eli picked up a stick and drew a rough square in the dirt. The footprint of the Cheyenne office building as Clara now had it memorized. 4 guards minimum, you said. Shifts?" Crow leaned forward. 2 outside, front and rear. 2 inside, ground floor. Goss himself sleeps in the building 4 nights out of 7 in a room, adjacent to the safe room. The other 3 nights he's at his private residence 2 streets over. Eli studied his dirt drawing. "And the safe?" Crow reached into his coat and produced something he hadn't shown them before. A small folded paper with a mechanical diagram on it. "Standard Herring and Farrell combination lock. 1874 model. I spent 6 weeks learning the mechanism." He paused. "I can open it in under 4 minutes if the room is quiet." Clara looked at the diagram, then at Crow, then at Eli. Eli was looking at Crow with his amber eye in that particular measuring way, After a long moment, he said, "You've been building to this for 3 years." "Yes," Crow said. "And you need 2 more people to make it work," Eli said. "Yes," Crow said again. Eli nodded once and looked back at his dirt drawing. He said nothing further, but his stick began adding details to the rough square in the dirt, doors and windows and guard positions, the quiet, focused drafting of a man who has accepted a mission and moved directly to its execution. Clara watched him work and felt something settle in her chest, that cold, clarifying sensation that was not quite calm and not quite readiness but lived somewhere between the two. Cheyenne, the ledger, the end of the Iron Syndicate. She touched Silas's pocket watch through the fabric of her coat and held it there for a moment. Then she pulled out the floor plan and spread it beside Eli's dirt drawing, and they worked through the night together while Crow kept watch and the fire burned down to coals. Dawn came slowly over the Wyoming flatlands, gray and reluctant, like a man who has received bad news and is in no hurry to face the day. The freightway station sat quiet in the early light, smoke threading up from its stone chimney in a thin, pale line. Inside, Clara had not slept. She had sat beside the dying fire with Crow's floor plan spread across her knees, memorizing every corridor and doorway and guard position, the way she had once memorized Scripture, not for comfort, but because precision was the only thing standing between a plan and a grave. Eli had slept for 4 hours in the corner, which was 3 more hours than Clara expected and 1 less than he needed. He woke before first light with his hand already moving toward his sharps, the old reflex that never fully rested even in sleep. Crow had taken the watch outside. When the light came up enough to see the road, he came back inside and stood in the doorway, his pale eyes reading the landscape behind him the way a careful man reads a room. "No sign of Vance's people on the freight road," he said. "Either they don't know about the tunnel exit, or they're ahead of us rather than behind." That second possibility hung in the cold air of the way station like smoke. Clara folded the floor plan carefully and tucked it inside, her coat beside Silas's pocket watch. "How far is Cheyenne?" she asked. 3 days riding on good horses," Crow said. "On those 2 mules, 4. Maybe 4.5 if McCall's leg slows us on the 2nd day." Eli looked up from checking his rifle. "My leg won't slow anything," he said with the flat, absolute certainty of a man issuing a statement of fact rather than a promise. They took the mules, leaving behind enough of the dried provisions to not constitute a complete theft, which Clara recognized was a small and probably meaningless moral accounting, but made nonetheless. The freight road north was open country, sparse pine giving way to rolling grassland, the sky enormous and pale above them, the wind coming in long, steady pushes from the northwest that had teeth in it even in the strengthening morning light. Open country meant visibility in both directions, which was simultaneously a comfort and an exposure. Clara rode with her eyes on the horizon line at all times, scanning the way Eli had taught her, not looking for specific things, but watching for wrongness, for the small visual anomalies that meant something was out of place. Cheyenne was not Deadwood. That was the first thing Clara registered when they crested the last low rise and the city, spread out below them in the thin afternoon light of the 4th day. Where Deadwood was chaos given a street grid, Cheyenne was ambition given a facade, wide, unpaved avenues lined with 2- and 3-story brick buildings, a proper rail depot at the southern edge, sending a column of white steam into the pale sky, churches and banks and a territorial courthouse with actual glass windows, catching the afternoon light. There were women on the boardwalks in decent clothes, and freight wagons moving in organized directions, and the general surface appearance of a place that had decided to call itself civilized and was committed to maintaining the performance. Clara knew better than to be reassured by it. The most dangerous corruption she had ever encountered had always come dressed in good clothes. Baron Sterling had worn a pressed suit and spoken in complete sentences and had ordered more killings than any man she had met in an open wilderness. Harlan Goss, by Crow's account, was Sterling with better political connections and a longer memory. The Iron Syndicate had not built its empire through open violence alone. It had built it through paperwork, through purchased legitimacy, through the very institutions that Cheyenne's clean brick face was designed to represent. The ledger in Goss's safe was proof of that. a book of careful, methodical evil recorded in columns and entries like a merchant's accounts. They split up at the city's northern edge, as they had agreed. Crow went first, alone on foot, because his face was known in Cheyenne from his previous attempts, and he needed to move through the city's back channels quietly and confirm that the office layout had not changed. Clara and Eli rode in separately an hour later, unhurried, presenting the unremarkable appearance of two road-worn travelers, arriving for legitimate purposes. Eli had his hat pulled low and his duster turned collar up, which partially obscured the distinctive amber eye. Clara had traded her worn trail coat for a plain dark wool jacket she'd acquired from the way station's stored goods, and she had put her hair up under her hat in a way that changed the shape of her silhouette. They took a room at a mid-grade hotel 2 streets from the syndicate. Office, close enough for reconnaissance, far enough to avoid the pattern of surveillance that Goss's men would run on their immediate vicinity. The room was small and had a window that looked onto the side street and a bed with an actual frame, which Clara sat on and found she had no particular feelings about after 4 days.